floor is yours, Adam.
Great. Good to see you here. This is Adam, and I'm going to be the chair of this session. And this is my pleasure to introduce you Laure Gnassou. She is a seasoned economist and an independent researcher with a particular interest in the African economies. She worked at the European Parliament, at the European Commission, the Central Bank of Finland, the French Ministry of Defense, and the UN, including peacekeeping mission. She has 14 years of field experience in Suriname, the DRC, and Burkina Faso. Laure, this is the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be part of this symposium, and thank you for the invitation. So let's talk about the very interesting issues, which is crypto money in Africa, and learning from the Central African Republic, a member of the CFA-Franc zone. Very important topic and very interesting because the case of this Central African Republic is definitely unique in Africa when it comes to cryptocurrency. So that's going to be, okay, so now that's going to be the outline of the presentation. And so let's discuss digital currencies in Africa. You have three instruments: mobile money, central bank digital currencies, and cryptocurrencies. Mobile money is very popular in Africa, very useful, and most of the population used to rely on mobile money rather than the banking system quite often. Central bank digital currencies are now developing in Africa, and several national central banks are working on that. And the two instruments, mobile money and central bank digital currencies, present more advantages than cryptocurrencies in terms of financial inclusion, payment efficiency, and remittances. Now, the case of cryptocurrency. Let's look at the market of cryptocurrencies in Africa. Here you can see on the slide the case of Eastern Europe crypto market and the Africa crypto market. First and foremost, the crypto market in Africa is very small. Only the market is only estimated at 2% of the global transaction activities. And I refer to the period from July 2021 to June 2022, and the information comes from chain analysis. But although it's a very small market, it's a very dynamic market because the key driver for the use of cryptocurrency in Africa are retail transaction, remittances, and commercial transaction. I discussed about transactions. Let's look at the legal framework. So obviously, the legal framework when it comes to cryptocurrency is under scrutiny throughout the world. And the collapse of FTX led to the Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to crash. And so there is a need to regulate the cryptocurrency world, I would say. But in Africa, you would see that most of the country opted for, or has opted for, restriction, ban, that official ban or informal ban, and only a few countries decided to regulate cryptocurrency. Here on the map, you see where is located Central African Republic. So let's find out a little bit more about this country. Central African Republic is a fragile state. Insecurity is still there in the country, and the country is facing humanitarian crisis. So you have a presence of a peacekeeping mission in Central African Republic, which has evolved in terms of structure since the implementation of the mission, peacekeeping mission. And the country is also facing a humanitarian crisis. If you look at the population, 5.5 million inhabitants in the country, and you look at the number of people requested humanitarian assistance, so you will see that the situation is quite critical. I mentioned it's a fragile state, but it's also a resource-rich country, very well known for diamond. oil, lithium, and it's a landlocked country. The country is facing two kinds of shocks: exogenous shocks, as most of the country and in the world, the effect of the war in Ukraine, and internal shocks. I mentioned the insecurity, humanitarian crisis. I just want you to focus on two aspects when it comes to the key socioeconomic data. Obviously, the country that, as I mentioned, is at the bottom of the Human Development Index, but I want you to focus on the access to electricity. Only 15.5% of the population in 2020 get access to electricity, and only 10% of the population in 2020 have access or use internet. And so that is very important to keep those kind of data in mind when you think about the development of cryptocurrency in this particular country. This is also a country which is member of the CFA franc zone. So that is very important to mention this fact. Why? And I'm going to explain that a little bit later about that, but let's find out about the CFA franc zone. So the CFA franc zone, and before talking about CFA franc zone, I should mention the franc zone. So in the 30s, end of the 30s, France and its colony created what we call the franc zone. And the franc zone gathered France and its colony at the time, but nowadays, the franc zone gathered France and 14 African countries. The CFA franc zone, it's only gathering the 14 African countries, and you can look at the map here. You have in yellow the UEMOA, and in orange the CEMAC, okay? And Comoros, a little island, but part of the CFA franc zone and part of the franc zone. Key feature of this monetary union, so special in the world, is the fact that there is a fixed nominal exchange rate parity between the CFA franc and the euro. Now the CFA franc is pegged to the euro. There is a free transferability throughout the CFA franc zone, a free convertibility between between the CFA franc and the euro, which is ensured by the French Treasury. And there is another specific issue, is the fact that the central banks, so the BCAO, the central banks, the BCAO is for this area here, UEMOA, and the central bank for the CEMAC, the BEAC, this is here. So the two central banks has to deposit 50% of their foreign reserve in operation account at the French Treasury. And another very specific issue, I mentioned that CFA franc is pegged to the euro. So what is happening now is the fact that, and since the fact that euro has become the currency for European Union, is the fact that the functioning of the CFA franc zone and the functioning of the franc zone is now regulated through the European Union Council decision of 23rd November 1998. And I want you to focus on the Article 3 and the Article 5. 3, it's the fact that if there is a change in terms of parity between the two currencies, the European institution has to be consulted and will have a say on this issue. The similar case will happen in the future. For the future of the CFA franc zone, the evolution of the CFA franc zone, the approval of the European institution will be required according to the Article 5. So now we know a little bit more about the CFA franc zone. We know about the Central African Republic, fragile state, a resource-rich country, member of the CFA franc. But this country is the second country in the world after El Salvador who decided to adopt a cryptocurrency and its unilateral adoption. And that was done the 22nd April 2022. So here we are, this is unique. This is unique. You have the CFA franc, still running, still operating, still used in the country, and now the introduction of the Bitcoin. And the country decided, the authority decided to go a little bit further by introducing a national cryptocurrencies called the Sango coin. So it's still a project, they're still working on it. And now they have decided also to draft a regulation on cryptocurrencies and tokenization. Now, let's look at here the CFA Franc, how the member of CFA Franc reacted. First and foremost, the adoption of cryptocurrencies in Central African Republic created tension between members of this monetary union. So the 6th May 2022, the COBAC, which is the Central African Banking Commission, decided to ban the use of cryptocurrency for financial transaction in the CEMAC. CEMAC, so the regional integration of countries, Francophone countries, which are part of, which are in Central Africa, excluding Congo. But now what is happening is that they try to work and to resolve this issue because there is an inconsistency between the Central African laws on cryptocurrency and the regulation governing cryptocurrencies and digital payment at the CEMAC level. So now why so much tension? And what is the problem? The problem is the fact that there are risks arising from adoption of the cryptocurrency as a legal tender. First, macroeconomic stability. The use of cryptocurrency could put public finance at risk. Keep in mind that the Central African Republic is experiencing the fact to have a limited fiscal space. It could generate impact on stability of the monetary union and create spillover effect for the other members state. And as I mentioned, you keep in mind, I mentioned the fact that these central banks of the CFA Franc zone, so the BCAO and the BEAC, but in this particular case, I refer to the BEAC, they have to deposit 15% of their foreign reserve at the French Treasury. So meaning that this is part of the problem, the tension that the adoption of the cryptocurrency has created within the CFA Franc zone. There is also a problem in terms of stability. Here you have a map, you have a graph where you can see the volatility of cryptocurrencies, and so definitely this will expose the banking system of the country to a massive fluctuation in cryptocurrencies prices. And the last aspect, which to me is also very critical, there is this need to fight against illicit financial flows. But the use of cryptocurrencies, because of the anonymity that provide the cryptocurrencies, will encourage illicit financial flows. So this is one thing. And as a reminder, the presence and the fact you have illicit financial flows affect the ability for the country to mobilize domestic revenues. So to conclude, there are a couple of issues to mention. The rise in digital currencies has taken place in Africa, as I mentioned. Africa is the smallest but fast-growing continent when it comes to trading cryptocurrencies, but the development of digital currencies, and in particular cryptocurrencies, facing several challenges. First and foremost, there is a need to address the infrastructure gap in terms of electricity, internet connectivity. And that's what so far limits the development of cryptocurrencies, particularly in Africa. There is a need to improve the regulations relating to the use of cryptocurrencies and protect consumers. And important, and I'm thinking about this kind of currencies, the currencies developed by central banks, central digital currencies. There is this need to develop expertise, technical capacities to manage various risks, such as cyber attacks and financial integrity, which can be affected. And what I would like to mention is that focusing on crypto money and the development of crypto money in Africa is important, but most of African most countries in sub-Saharan Africa are confronted with multidimensional crises. Have in mind the case of Mali, Burkina Faso, and so that are among the challenges that the continent is facing. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Laure. It was a great presentation. I really learned a lot from it. And I see that the discussant has arrived. Tinashe, are you ready to discuss Laure's presentation? Tinashe?
Yes, sorry.
No problem. Let me introduce you, Tinashe. Tinashe Nyamunda is an associate professor in the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. His main research interests include the 19th to 21st century economic history of the Southern Africa, focusing particularly on the politics of money and exchange. His other but related research interests are in economic immigration, remittances, and the exchange aspects of the artisans mining. Tinashe, we are waiting for your contribution. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. I think I learned a lot from Laure Gnassou's presentation, which was really, really good and really, really informative. So just a quick one. How many minutes do I have?
5 minutes.
Roughly 5 minutes. Okay, so
Yes.
I'll try to compress everything in 5 minutes. But I think her presentation to me is demonstrating the experiences that have, of the Central African Republic when it adopted its Sango coin. And I think she's nicely spelled out the environment or the context of the Central African Republic with its 5.4 million people, in which, to be clear, perhaps only 10% of the population has access to these facilities offered by cryptocurrencies. And the other thing that I picked up, which came through, is that there's a whole lot of challenges that the country faces outside of its economy, which have to do with political instability, the humanitarian crisis, and the numerous other challenges that it faces. So the question about the introduction of cryptocurrency, I think, is particularly important. And I think this is what Laure's presentation brings to us. Now, I'm just going to rush quickly to two particularly good points. The one where she gave us the historical background of the CAR being part of the CFA, the Franc zone. That's the first one. And then the second important aspect, which has to do with trying to introduce a cryptocurrency in that particular context. So why is it important to me? I think it is particularly important because it demonstrates a few important points. It's cryptocurrency, the name currency itself demonstrates that it's money. And usually scholars tend to want to look at money as something that is value-free, something that is that should be accepted and implemented naturally across the world, right? However, the very fact that the CAR is part of the Franc zone demonstrates that there are power dynamics associated with adopting certain kinds of currencies. Now, I'm starting with the point that she made about the CFA zone and the way in which it is regulated to demonstrate that the context within which even the cryptocurrency is going to be or has been sort of introduced is also problematic. So, you know, a number of historians have questioned why those 14 CFA countries still retain those links, particularly given that a lot of their foreign currency reserves are still kept in France, and there in come the power dynamics. So for me, that background demonstrates that, you know, there are these instabilities, this inequality in terms of the international power relations between these former French colonies and these CFA countries. Now, how does cryptocurrency come in? Again, this is not an African innovation. It's an innovation that is coming from outside. And it's an innovation that is exclusive, especially if it only reaches a small proportion of the population, right? And in that context, even that innovation itself is dependent on a number of variables. Now, what are these variables? If I'm not mistaken, cryptocurrency at its peak was well over 60,000. Maybe someone can correct me from the audience or from amongst the other people here. But right now, cryptocurrency, if I'm not mistaken, is around 20,000. So cryptocurrency in itself is highly volatile, it's unstable, it's got a market price that is determined by the market itself. And you're talking about an African country whose macroeconomic fundamentals are already problematic. So if that proportion of people that have access to the internet and electricity, which is less than 10%, are to invest in it and to trade in it, it's also something that in the context of Africa would also be problematic because it's adding an extra volatile aspect to that economy. Now, I had another point that I wanted to make. I hope I don't run out of time before I do that. And it had to do with about how Africa can think beyond crypto. I suppose crypto could be looked at, in my view at least, looking at the example that Laure has given us, you know, as an investment asset by those people who have the capacity to do so and who can afford to run a loss or to wait until the market stabilizes. But in terms of other forms of currencies, or let me just say digital currencies, I think there are other examples. I wondered if Laure could tell me more about whether she can compare between the introduction of the cryptocurrency, whether it's Sango coin or whatever it is, or the use of Bitcoin within that context of the Central African Republic, and such innovations as M-Pesa in Kenya, as well as Econet in Zimbabwe, right? And I'm wondering to what extent cryptocurrency would fare better than these other digital money platforms that have been introduced in these various places. The second presentation, obviously, from Bryan is going to look a little bit more on the Zimbabwe case. But I'm just curious to see if the government in the CAR has considered something that is more African, more homegrown, beyond bringing it from elsewhere. Then I'm just going to go to the conclusion and maybe conclude my own remarks as well, where I think Laure was talking about how digital currencies are rising in Africa, you know, the use of digital currencies, but she also mentioned, you know, the challenges such as electricity and internet connectivity. I'm in South Africa, which is probably the second largest economy electricity doesn't just go. So fortunately, we are on stage 2, which means that we are okay. And even as I speak to you, I hope you can still hear me. There's a message that popped up. There's a message that popped up on my computer that says your internet is unstable.
No,
so
we can hear you.
Even in an economy like that, if we get to stage 6, stage 7 of electricity load shedding, you're looking at 12 hours of no internet. Now, the ways in which crypto works, I noticed in places like Sweden and other colder places, they have these numerous machines that they invest in to mine Bitcoin. And I suppose what they get out of it is probably like 1.5 Bitcoin per day for those who are doing it at a large scale. And those who are still building up that infrastructure may get 0.00 whatever of that Bitcoin. Would we be able to sustain that if in the better countries on the continent, we're facing this huge energy crisis and the numerous other economic problems? The second thing, all right, let me finalize. has to do with the regulation. Given the blockchain technology around the ways in which crypto is managed, in what ways would African countries be able to regulate that? And I suppose the final point is, when we're talking about expertise and the technical capacity to challenge risk, how would we be able to do that on a platform that's completely disconnected from the ways in which people use them? So let me leave it at that and end by saying, Laure, thank you for a very lovely presentation, but those are just some of the questions that arise.
Thank you, Tinashe. Thank you, Tinashe. Laure, could you please start to reply? And we received one question in the chat. You want me to read it out loud, or you can, or you've already? And meanwhile, let me ask the audience to raise their hands if they want to contribute also. Thank you. Okay, Perry.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very interested in the monetary economics of the CFA Franc area. What I know about it comes from the book by Nongosamba Silla, which probably many people here know. Translated into English for me, thank you. And so the history of the CFA Franc, this sort of repressed financial situation gradually increasing, and it used to be attached to the franc and now to the euro. So my question for you, you gave a lot of reasons why it's a bad idea to have crypto. So I wonder who's pushing this? Why is this happening? That's number one. And in particular, you mentioned that there's not just Bitcoin, which already exists, but the, in fact, creation of an indigenous crypto coin, Sango coin. What's the connection between those and who's pushing that? So some of the political economy of this, if you know, I would be very interested to hear.
Okay, so you see me smiling. I think my smile gives you some indication that it's a complex issue. So here we have these economic matters, which is entangled with geopolitics. Okay, so I'm providing some elements of response, but I'm going to be diplomat by answering your question by saying that definitely the political environment and the political and security environment may have push to the fact that the authority decided to go ahead and opt for the Bitcoins. I'm diplomat by answering your question. Other aspect that I will say, why the Sango coin? I think the Sango coin maybe is the willingness to have the Bitcoin, but have a national Bitcoin. The idea behind that, what I think about the authorities, is that they at the end of the day, why having a currency and why opting for cryptocurrency is they are opting to develop the country. Is it the right path to use crypto as a way out to attract investors? To me, I would advocate for first fix the security and political and try to have political stability on the long run. That will attract the interest of investors, because those kind of investors who might come in the country right now, it's very volatile. It's all about, it's close to speculation. So I did not answer properly your question by saying who is behind, but I think I give you some clues. And I strongly believe that geopolitics has a lot to do with that. And Tinashe mentioned that also.
But by that, just to follow up, you mean sort of resistance to this French control or European control?
No, well, that is difficult to say as such, because I worked on at the European Commission, and at the time I worked on the introduction of the euro and its impact on CFA franc countries. So I was in it when we had to do this transition from national currencies and go to the euro. So I might have a different approach. I won't say it's about repression, but I think that over the time, the presence of the CFA franc has contributed to a monetary stability. I lived and worked in Congo, in the DR Congo, and I can tell you the volatility is very high because it's a dollarized economy. There are much more security and stability within the CFA franc zone over the years compared to countries who has opted for national currencies anchored on the dollars, for instance. So this is part of the reason why so far I haven't heard authorities from Central African Republic denouncing the fact that they have the CFA franc. And that to me is a major aspect.
This. We have two more questions, and then the second presenter is going to. So Karen and Asghar. Karen, please.
Yeah, I need a little bit more information about how this is going to work. It's not, I suppose, going to replace the CFA franc. I mean, among ordinary people as a coin, as a means of circulation. But in what way is it going to impact on the monetary flows and stocks? Or is it just a little extra that is being offered for investors? That's not clear to me. Thinking about the Salvadoran experience, which really tried to get to people, that has been a major failure and also very unstable. So it seems to me that would be very dangerous. But let me just revert to another question. The CFA franc is characterized by not only stability, but also stagnation. The countries in the CFA franc are relatively more stagnating, not so dynamic as the others around them, like Ghana, for example. And one of the reasons is that they have very tight restrictions on monetary policy impact on fiscal policy. They're not allowed to take debts in the central bank. The Treasury is not allowed to take debt in the central bank. So they have not been able to generate a lot of economic dynamics through the government, except now that some of them are issuing bonds. But is this a way of, in the Central African Republic, do they want to get around some of these restrictions? Is one of my questions, is a question that you otherwise have on the fiscal policy regime. Or is it a way of attracting more Russian investors? That could also be asked. We know that the Wagner Group is active in the Central African Republic and is developing its resources. So what is suspicion in that direction? Thank you.
Very, very interesting comment and questions. What I would say is that definitely you can see that the use of Bitcoins in the country, it's much more for the elite, okay, and foreigners. So then I can leave that to your imagination to find out who might be interested in having such a kind of currencies. Also keep in mind, it's a resource-rich country. You have diamond, you have gold. So, and definitely there is a need for foreign direct investors, foreign direct investment in the country. And so for attracting investors, that's why I was mentioning what kind of investors the country is expecting to attract. It's much more in terms of speculation, or it is for real development. Then you mentioned this issue, so I hope I answered part of your question. Then you mentioned about stagnation when it comes to CFA franc countries compared to Ghana, for instance. I would say that, again, what is missing, and I lived and worked in West Africa, and particularly Burkina Faso. I think the issue is much more complex. You have the currency, which is a key aspect, but you also the need for the developing the country. The development of the country is in terms of infrastructure, is also in terms of socio-economic development. And so focusing only on the currency is one aspect, but not the entire part of the problem. And so CFA Franc Zone will lead people to work and talk a lot about is structure. What I would say, and that is something that you have to keep in mind, whatever future will be for the CFA franc is now involved European institutions, because the CFA franc is pegged to the euro. So again, I would advise you to go and check this EU Council decision of 23rd November 1998 on CFA franc and Comorian franc. And I will advise you to read Article 5, which says that any plans to change the nature of the scope of the agreement shall be submitted by France to the Commission, the European Central Banks, and another European structure. Such plan requires the approval of the Council on the basis of the recommendation of the Commission and after consultation of the European Central Bank. So, as I said, the future of the CFA franc is in the hand of African countries, but also in the hand of European countries and members of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Asger, could you please very quick ask your question? And Laure, please reply just one sentence. Thank you, because the second presenter is here.
Yeah, I will just read Malay's question from the chat. Do you know how much Bitcoin crypto has the CRI monetary authority accumulated in the reserves? Has the French authorities issued an official statement about the new crypto policy? So this is not mine. She couldn't use her mic. And the second question, would Sango coin be a floating currency or a stable coin? And my question was supposed to be if you had a comment on the common African currency, because we had news of the common Latin American currency. So, but the time is running out, so I just want to throw this in.
I'm going to be very brief. I don't know, because I think part of the information is still kept confidential. I won't say secret, I will say confidential, being diplomat. But obviously, I think everybody wants to know more about the use of these currencies and how everything will evolve, because members of the CFA franc zone are all watching what is happening, and definitely, as Tinashe mentioned, the introduction of the cryptocurrency in a monetary framework, which was not perfect but working, destabilize a little bit the structure. So thank you, and I stay free to discuss with whoever wants to discuss this issue in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laure. And please read the chat, because there are a couple of questions there and maybe you can reply there. Okay, the next presenter is going to be Dr. Bryan Kauma, who is a food and environmental historian who uses the protected history of the food in revisiting old historiographies and telling new stories. He is a lecturer in African Modern History at Durham University, and his presentation title is Zimbabwe's Currency Battles. And I'm coming from Hungary, and we learned in the school that the highest inflation was in Zimbabwe. Please let me know if that is correct or not. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that morning or afternoon or evening to everyone, depending on which part of the hemispheres. My name is Bryan. Before I start, can you guys see my?
We can see your slides. Yes.
You can see my slides. Excellent. I'm a food and environmental historian, but that's what I did much later on for my PhD. But my training is in economic history from the University of Zimbabwe. And so part of my presentation and my talk today is trying to integrate these experiences that I've had over space and time. Food history as a lens to rethink about Zimbabwe's so-called crisis period, looking at currencies over time and space. And these four integrated view as being nostalgic that what we have and what we experience within the overtures of Zimbabwe's economic history are mainly more of a transition, different transitions, different economic transitions, as opposed to always attributed as a crisis. And but just to contextualize us from where this whole conversation is going to and the currency landscape that's in Zimbabwe, I'd like us to watch this video, which is by the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is speaking on a panel with regards to currency at the time.
So the revenue we have, if you compare it with the US dollar, in South Africa, the 14 rands, $1 US. I'm not so sure what it is, but it's also around 9, which I don't know what it is. The question is, so it is however necessary to walk that journey. And our mind is on. But as we move on, it is necessary that we carry everybody. And to carry everybody, we must our people as to what all this means. That if we don't do this, what will happen? I don't think there is any single Zimbabwe who would continue to want to have a collapsed economy. But to rise from those issues of for a collapsed economy, certain things must be sacrificed for us.
All right. All right. It's about the currency, one of the currencies that's being used in Zimbabwe, the RTGS, which is a form of an online. And the context of this whole conversation was Zimbabwe was an experience period where you had a multi-currency system composed of a lot of foreign currency, which was mainly the US dollar, pound, rand, and the pula, which was at the Zimbabwean economic crisis following the 2000 land reform and the subsequent economic sanctions and the downturn that took place within the whole period. But at the same time, it was also never solidly mentioned at a huge impact in shaping the currency narratives within the country. And you then realize that in many countries globally, and in Zimbabwe in particular, I tend to our flowing system was directly tied to the nature of politics. It was that were on the ground. And one of the methods that I then used to try and scale down and integrate it is through using Zimbabwe over the past few decades when I speak to different people, and the issue of food security is always a recurring issue. Everyone saw later Robert Mugabe, who was our former president, and the land reform. And he brings about different feelings on different sides of the social and political and academics. But essentially what I then pick up from the different images of Robert Mugabe is that first, this is what I want to talk about today, showing how what least we have tenders on the one end, we also have the development of food. Essentially, food security became a critical factor that was shaping see how food and grain in particular became its own form of currency, which then reverts us back to early, perhaps pre-colonial eras when African societies and using barter trade. So you see food historically has always been a metaphor, has been used as a metaphor to express money in a lot of Italian movies as depicted by Hollywood. When they're speaking about dough, it's not necessarily just about baking, but they'll be speaking about their money. And even when they speak about bread, there's always that reference. In Zimbabwe, food literally became a currency between the period 2000 to 2008. And we then use this to see that violent nature of money and how money has been understood differently, and how it has also made us to rethink the idea of crisis within different economic spheres. But my conversation is not devoid of about such conversations. We've got different scholars such as Nyamunda and Sibanda, Makina and Nguyen, who've spoken about the different nature of currency and how Zimbabwe is not unique to within the history of Zimbabwe. You've seen them using what has been known as a Zimex, bearer checks, bond notes, plus a whole full currency values. In our discussion today, I'll also highlight how at some runaway inflation, which had skyrocketed, and the whole currency, the currency, was now filled. Inflation, you have the country Reserve Bank government reducing the face value of what is on the currencies. And so that's, I'm now speaking about such mitigation measures within this conversation of, and then I also try to show how this crisis economy is part of a conversation of toxic politics, understand the value of money on the market. And here we see patronage politics coming into play, as control of the money, and who does not have control of the money. In part, that perhaps for me, when I reflect on this conversation, within this decade, from 2000 to 2010, 2008, thereabout, if we use that as a reflective mirror of Zimbabwe's history, either social, economic, one may not be too lost in the idea that from historians or learns nothing from history, because we see over and over. Plus, more importantly, we see abrupt the monetary landscape taking place, which then also informs the nature that existed within the country. A key indicator, because the currency on its own became more static and became more reliable as a form of currency. And literally at this point, you see people that can much significantly. And more importantly, you see people's understanding of money shifting in what currency consciousness. And so we see currency and the diverse needs and politics on the ground and shaping the different social narratives within Zimbabwe. This is an example of part of the many currencies that you had in Zimbabwean dollars. And I'm shy to actually say that this was not the most existed at some point. But in have within the country at that time would be you market, you want to buy bread. The moment you're in the queue, the bread is priced from the shelf. It was $100 billion. By the time you get, the price has since changed. It's been updated within the system, and so viable and very taxing to constantly carry cash and to have access to cash because you need huge amounts of money just to get the bare basics. And with the runaway inflation that was taking place, it was really hard to also keep on pumping in enough money into the food economy, relying on goods as a form of currency. Now, this is just a generic landscape of how intense food insecurity was at the time, which was widespread across the country. And more importantly, where food became critical because of the environment affecting the output of grain and essential food. So you now have two situations where the currency on its own, at the end, the food that becomes the main staple and the main reliant society is also now not as accessible anymore because of food that's coming in from farmers. And essentially this can also be tied to the land reform program and the nature in which it took place, which disrupted the flow of agricultural patterns within Zimbabwe. And so
Bryan, excuse me to interrupt. You have only 2 more minutes to your presentation.
That's all right. That's okay. And amid all of this, you see a lot of political frustration. The currency battles brought in about an informal market for different money and different currencies. And more essentially, where my story comes in is how these new multi-currencies were scaled upon, creating a new informal market that was only understandable and only relevant within the Zimbabwean context, but essentially was also triggering inflation amongst its neighbors. I'll close with this anecdote where at one point I remember ice cream, 2-liter container of ice cream in Zimbabwe was going for 50 Rand. Yet in South Africa, that same container was going for Rand. So on one trip when I went to South Africa to do a bit of grocery shopping, when I saw this container going for 15 Rand, I was very happy to buy it at 20 Rand. And because I gave the lady at the counter the 20 Rand and I told her to keep change. My keep telling her to keep change meant that I could afford 15 Rand ice cream for 20 Rand. And this story was not unique to me. A lot of Zimbabwean and the informal evaluation of these foreign currencies back in Zimbabwe then triggered a spur in inflation in other countries because they knew that a lot of now reliant on Zimbabweans who were coming in for grocery shopping. And this then I also then come and argue social and economic relations within the region. Battles and so I use hunger to discuss how food and currency have played a different role and make us re-understand Zimbabwe's social and economic history over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Tinashe, can you please give us your discussion?
All right. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think like others, we kind of struggled to hear Mnangagwa speak, when the clip was played. And maybe it's my bandwidth. I couldn't pick up some of the presentation, but at least, I picked up on some of what was said. So if I'm not mistaken, I suppose that was the Capital interview in which Mnangagwa was arguing that Zimbabwe has the strongest currency in the region when they introduced what Bryan was talking about as the RTGS dollar or the RTGS currency, which means real-time gross transfer settlement scheme. I think that's the longest name of a currency I've ever come across. And I think the basis of Bryan's discussion, if I followed it correctly, is that politics played a significant part in the currency dynamics and the currency experiences that Zimbabwe experienced between 2000 to 2010. And because of the instability that came in as a result of whatever political challenges the country was facing, resulted in hyperinflation and people trying to imagine other ways in which they could continue to trade in a context where there were significant cash shortages. And one of the ways in which people did this was to actually trade in grain, right? For whatever it is that they wanted, whether it was second-hand clothes or whatever it is, and hence looking at food as grain. Now, if you look at, the characteristics that money has according to, classical economics, it has to be something that is scarce. And in a context of food insecurity, I suppose this is what it meant, that in the context of food scarcity, food became an important currency in itself. And I suppose this is what led Bryan to make the conclusions that he made, that wherever you could then find food, you could afford to say keep change if you've got whatever money you've got, because that's how important it had become. Now, I think what Bryan is presenting is a very fascinating history about a country that suffered one of the, in fact, the highest hyperinflation in the world, at least in the 21st century, but one of the highest in world history anyway. But I think there are a few points that, or a few questions that I would ask to Bryan. And these questions have to do with the way in which he's looking at Zimbabwe, because the challenges that Zimbabwe's economy faced, or at least the current challenges that it faced, he attributes this to internal politics. I'm wondering to what extent you could consider international factors, right? The fact that the Zimbabwean currency was actually pegged to the US dollar from independence in 1980, and therefore that makes it, if I'm to borrow the terms that Jane Gaia, Karin Palava, and others have used, the hard-soft currency spectrum, where, your greenback is a hard currency and this emerging currency is a soft currency. What relationships were built by the establishment of this kind of a currency in a country that had been formerly a British colony for almost 90 years, and which had used a sterling-backed currency until roughly about 1965, and which was adopting this new peg only in 1980, right? What does this mean? This is a question that I've got for you. Perhaps I can speak about it a little later, but I would want to hear your perspective about this. The second point has to do with a comment that you made earlier on in your presentation, when you spoke about Zimbabwe's violent return to the past, and you were talking about the use of barter. I don't know whether this is a correction or it's a point of discussion. I would actually argue that the introduction of colonial currencies, in fact, introduced specific purpose money, rather than the multi-purpose currencies that had existed in the pre-colonial period. It's actually a neoclassical myth, or in fact, it's a fallacy to argue that Africa bartered. Remember, Africa had been trading with Europe and other parts of the world, and with people from the Middle East from as early as the 14th century onwards. And in fact, they did use certain kinds of coins in trade, right? And they did use certain kinds of pre-colonial currencies, which I'm not going to talk about now. And whatever currencies that were used had multi-purpose and tended to be community types of currencies, depending on which state we're talking about. So the pre-colonial period, at least as far as I can tell, actually introduced this very somewhat disconnected currency blocks where you had your escudo, your sterling, your franc, and so forth, and which reconfigured trade in ways in which imperial centers actually exploited these African colonies that were within their currency areas. Now, what does it mean when all of a sudden these countries gain their independence and they have to establish currency, whether they're currency board or reserve banks, and they have to establish independent currencies in that context, right? Is that not a recipe for going back to using food as a currency because their currencies hyperinflate all the time? So that's something perhaps that you would want to think about. And then in the context of post-colonial Africa, even when we were talking about Mnangagwa calling the RTGS the strongest currency in the region, couldn't you look at food as one in a basket of multiple currencies? Because while Mnangagwa is talking about the RTGS dollar, this is legal tender, this is state money, right? But what about other multiple monetary forms? The previous speaker spoke of the introduction of cryptocurrency in the Central African Republic. We introduced digital currency in the form of EcoCash, which at one point was, I suppose, the biggest form of exchange used in the country. You know, others talk about remittances and the ways in which they were useful and the ways in which they set up an informal market that challenged the formal market. Can't we then, in that context, talk about these multiple forms of money and food being one of them? Or even if we're going to cite Mnangagwa's legal tender as being the other, and what does that mean in the context of an African country that is struggling to find itself in the global exchange system? So I'm not going to take too much time. I know we're out of time, but my big point, my big takeaway is that I think you gave a very interesting presentation about the ways in which food is critical in exchange. But at the same time, my challenge to you is to consider some of the questions that I'm talking about, to say, what about exogenous factors beyond just the political issues that you discussed as leading to the instability in Zimbabwe? We can discuss the others in the, Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Tinashe. It was a great discussion as always from you. I'm afraid that we are already in the break, and I'm afraid that we are not able to have any more questions and comments. Bryan, just a couple of thoughts from your side, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Tinashe. You are right. The currency landscape is very complex, essentially because of the different standing points that amid the hyperinflation that was skyrocketing and the pandemonium that was taking place, you also have many people in Zimbabwe at the same time buying would be done via mortgage over top of the range cars within this whole currency madness that was taking place. And that's the part that brings me this, that also triggers my interest to say that how do we also now come and explain that you have the highest inflation in the world at this point, and yet you're not, some of your citizens are the few that are going outside to look for survival. When they're buying and they're shopping outside, they're willing to pay more than the market prices for goods. Where is this money coming from? Where is the money coming from amid all this pandemonium? And those are some of the questions that I'm also now trying to trace back historically. And also essentially, also now tied on a nostalgic point of independence, and how a lot of people along the corridors, things were lovely when they had the Zim dollar and they showed, and then they use that as a scale and as a measure to see how the economy and the politics have either tumbled down or improved over time. And so it then presents interesting factors for me. But you are right. I also want to think of Zimbabwe as the global factors to say that how the economy affecting its currency landscape in terms of when sanctions were imposed starting from 2000 and what's of America. How did that affect the currency, the flow of currency coming into the country, either in terms of foreign direct investments or just access, lending access? How did that shape the currency landscape? Money and individuals' ability to have money. Those are some of the key questions that I must admit it's a handful for me. I'm also struggling to also with more essentially because also the article that I'm trying to write has got a word limit. So there are so many other things that perhaps extend over. But thank you for your insight and incorporate them into my discussions.
Thank you, Bryan. And let me echo what Jay wrote in the chat. And in case you have a text counting limit, Bryan, I would encourage you to write several articles, not just one. And with that, I think that we should go to a very short break. And then Alex is going to be the chair in the next session, which is going to start in 5 or 10 minutes, Alex?